case about a cold-blooded revenge killing of a young girl. It's also a case about betrayal and the gaining of a young girl's confidence in order to snuff out her life. On January 13th, 2019, this man, seated right here in this courtroom, Mr. Owen Shover, used an elaborate ruse and deception to get 16-year-old Rhonda Bionas out of her home and into his car. He let her drive the car. She was excited about that. And through that ruse and through that deception, he took her up to the Box Springs area of Moreno Valley after they drove around the streets of Moreno Valley for a little while, to go up there purportedly to be part of a drug deal. There was no drug deal. There was no one waiting for them in the Box Springs mountain area. It's isolated. And Mr. Shover took her up there for one reason. And we don't know exactly how, but when he got her up there, he took her life. However, whatever means he chose to take her life, we know that he spilled her blood, and a lot of it. And he put her lifeless body into his dad's car, his white Nissan Versa, into the back trunk area of that car. And he never returned to Moreno Valley. He left the Box Springs Canyon area with the Rhonda's lifeless body in the back, and he got on the 215 freeway and he drove north to Hesperia. And on the way, he contacted his brother. Drove all the way to his home where he lived with his dad and his stepmom and his brother in Hesperia. Was there for 5 minutes, 7 minutes. He quickly left, picked up his brother Gary, who was down the street in another home at another home in Hesperia. And the two of them drove that white Nissan Versa up to the San Bernardino Mountains. And they drove around up there for quite some time. And at some point, Owen and Gary, two brothers, disposed of Rhonda's body somewhere in the vast wilderness area of the San Bernardino Mountains. And despite a massive search by the Riverside Sheriff's Department, they never found Rhonda's body. And to this day, no one has found Rhonda's body. And that day, January 13th, 2019, is the last day that anyone has ever heard from Rhonda Bionas again, or ever seen her, or there's been any sign of life from Rhonda Bionas. Now, this is an opening statement. Now is the time for an opening statement. And as the judge just mentioned to you, an opening statement is a roadmap. I like to think of it as a roadmap. It gives you a preview. It's just what it sounds like, an opening, a preview of what the evidence is going to show. I'm not permitted to argue the case. I'm not permitted to analyze the evidence or suggest how you should look at it. So I'm just going to tell you what I believe the evidence is going to show. But like a map, it's not the same as actually being there. When you look at a map, you see the roads and the cities and the boundaries and the mountain ranges, and it gives you, it's a symbol, and it gives you a sense of maybe where you're going and how to get there, and you don't get lost. But it's not the same as actually being there. Evidence is what comes from the witness stand. And the details of this case are going to come one after another. And as the judge mentioned to you, jury trials are not scripted events. It's going to unfold for you for the first time ever live from the witness stand as it happens. In January of 2019, Rhonda Bionas was 16 years old. She was living in Moreno Valley. I'll just show you here. This is Rhonda Bionas, 16 years old. You'll have this photo and a couple others that you can review. She was young, she was naive, she was living with her maternal grandfather, Carl, and her uncle, Matthew, and her brother, Daniel. See, Rhonda had been adopted by her grandfather and grandmother when she was 3 years old. She was born in 2002. Neither of her parents, both of her parents, lived troubled lives and were not meaningful parts of her life growing up. She's raised by her grandparents, her uncle, and in 2019 she's living in Moreno Valley with this extended family along with her brother, and there are very few rules on Rhonda. She was a 16-year-old girl, teenager, and she was wild. And she was sneaking out, running the streets and talking to boys and drinking alcohol and using drugs. And that's what Rhonda was doing. Those are the choices that she made when she was 16. There hadn't been much parental discipline since her grandmother had died a few years prior. And so she liked to sneak out, liked to go party. You're going to hear that she used alcohol and drugs, including cocaine. You're going to hear that the last years of her life, she was living this kind of lifestyle, especially that last year. She had been expelled from Moreno Valley High School in 2017, along with the defendant, Owen. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, how that came about. At the time, January of 2019, she was attending continuation school, doing well, doing better in her schooling. You're going to hear from a teacher that knew her at that continuation school. She had a job she was excited about at Charlie's Philly Cheesesteak in the Moreno Valley Mall. She did not have a car. She liked to drive whenever she could. Like so many teenagers nowadays, she was on this phone constantly. She used social media apps. She posted videos, text messages, emojis, messengers, you name it. It seems like no experience in life that Rhonda came across or experienced that she didn't post about it or talk about it digitally. That was her life. She loved her family. She loved her cat, close to her brother, had a small group of friends, and they kept in contact almost constantly sending messages to one another, constantly telling each other what they're doing, even the most mundane things. She's a lot like a normal 16-year-old in today's society with these phones that we carry around in our pockets. Let me take you back now to the incident where Rhonda was expelled from Moreno Valley High School. The incident occurred 14 months before January of 2019, 14 months before she disappeared. In November of 2017, in fact, it was November 7th, 2017. You see, Rhonda Bionas and Owen were friends in high school. He was older than her, but they knew each other and were friends. And on that day, November 7th, 2017, they were both ditching school. And they left high school and they walked to a nearby park. And they were standing around with a large group of other high school students that had ditched that day. And somebody yelled, "Police." And the students scattered. And in that moment, when the students scattered, the defendant in this case, Owen, he either put in the hand of Rhonda Bionas or he tossed her a weapon that he had. And in the chaos, Rhonda took that weapon for a moment and started to also run and quickly tossed it into a drainage culvert. Now, there was a police officer that was patrolling around that day, and that's what caused, whoever yelled police, that's what caused that to be blurted out. Police officer was Deputy Belgarde. He was a school resource officer at Moreno Valley High School. He was on patrol that day. You're going to hear from him, looking for truants, looking for kids ditching class going to the nearby park. What he's going to tell you is that he saw a young woman. In his report he put juvenile female. He saw a young girl throw a shiny object into a drainage culvert. So everybody scattered, but he focused on her. He was able to detain her, and it turned out to be a Rhonda Bionas. He went back to that culvert, and he looked in there, and he was able to recover a weapon. Don't speculate what kind of weapon it is. For your purposes, you just need to know that it was a weapon. And he recovered that weapon, and he went back to Rhonda. She admitted that she had it, but she also told him how she had gotten that weapon. That Owen Shover had put that weapon in her hand. You're going to hear from Rhonda's brother, Daniel. He's going to tell you that she confided in him about what happened on that day in November 2017. You're going to hear that she was afraid to testify against Owen Shover, but that she was willing, and that she had made the decision to do that if necessary. Now, it turns out that ultimately there was no prosecution of either Rhonda Bionas or Owen Shover for that weapon, for possession of that weapon. But both of them were expelled from Moreno Valley High School based on that incident. Rhonda stayed in Moreno Valley and went to a continuation school. And Owen Shover had been living in Moreno Valley with his mother. He left Moreno Valley, and he went to live with his father and stepmother up in Hesperia, and went to a school up there. A little over a year later, when Rhonda and Owen would next get together, would be the day that she would disappear. So let's talk about January 13th, 2019. Rhonda left home that day in the early afternoon, late afternoon. She left home. She walked from her home to a park called Bayside Park that's within walking distance of her home. And on the way there, or just prior to leaving, she called a friend and said she was going to meet somebody at this park, and she didn't want to wait alone. So she said, "Come and meet me." So her friend and another friend came, and they met at Bayside Park, again, just very close to Rhonda's home. And they waited. They smoked marijuana. You'll hear that. They waited. And a few minutes later, the defendant showed up in a white Nissan Versa. This Nissan Versa belonged to Stephen Shover, the defendant's father. And you're going to hear that the defendant got out of his car. You can hear from witnesses that were there at the park that day that in that moment at Bayside Park in Moreno Valley, Rhonda Bionas got in the car with Owen Shover in that white Nissan Versa. And they left together in that car. She was driving. Now, you're going to learn that she was never seen from or heard from again. I've already mentioned that. Her friends never saw her again. Her family never heard from her or saw her again. She never posted another message to Snapchat, Instagram, or Facebook. She never posted another video. She never texted anybody, never called anyone, nothing. As if she fell off the face of the earth. Her phone, an hour later or so, from that moment when she gets in the car with Owen Shover, went dead and never came back on and has never been found. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, still no contact from Rhonda. Her normal patterns of life completely ceased. Now you're talking about a 16-year-old girl, you're not talking about someone who had a corporate job. You're talking about someone who lived the life of a teenager, but she still had patterns of life. You're going to learn that there were two distinct investigations in this case, and this will be important. The first investigation was a missing persons investigation. And that was done by the Moreno Valley Police Department or the Sheriff's Station of Moreno Valley. They're one and the same. And that investigation, that happened early on, took about 9 days. After about 9 days, the investigation was turned over to the Central Homicide Unit and investigator Jim Dickey. Jim Dickey is seated at council table today. Jim Dickey is the lead investigator on this case. He is an investigator with the Sheriff's Central Homicide Unit. And you're going to learn that these two investigations had very different purposes. The first investigation, the missing persons investigation, they're trying to find Rhonda, trying to bring her home, making sure she wasn't a runaway, running down leads. The second investigation changed gears. The second investigation was designed to find out what happened to Rhonda and who did it. So the purposes of these two investigations are different. You're going to hear about that from the witnesses. Defendant was obviously the last person seen with Rhonda. And so investigators had questions for Mr. Schober. Now, during that first investigation, in that very tight frame of time after January 13th, he gave two statements to police. Mr. Schober did, the defendant in this case. The first statement, Monday, January 14th, the next day, was a phone call with Investigator Flores from the Moreno Valley Police Department. And the second was at his home on January 16th, 2019, 3 days after she went missing. That second interview was recorded by Investigator Bilavia by her body-worn camera, and you're going to see that entire interview as evidence in this case. And what Owen Schober said to the investigators was that, yes, he had gone and picked up Rhonda Bionas. Yes, she had driven his car. Yes, they drove around Moreno Valley. He denied anything about drug deal. He said that they went up to Box Springs to hang out. And then Mr. Schober told Investigator Bilavia that after that, he took her back to Moreno Valley, took Rhonda Bionas back to Moreno Valley. And he dropped her off at Community Park at her request. That she asked to be taken to Community Park, and that he complied. And that once they got to Community Park in Moreno Valley, Rhonda Bionas got out of his car, the white Nissan Versa, and got into a gray sedan, small type car is how he described it. That he couldn't tell who or how many people were in the gray car. He didn't get a license plate, didn't pay attention to get a license plate. But that Rhonda willingly got into that other car, and that other car drove off. And that's all he knew. And as I said, this was at the beginning, this was at the missing persons stage of the investigation. And so the investigators essentially took Owen Schober at his word. And they essentially took his statement and kept looking for Rhonda Bionas. Now you're going to hear from various witnesses in this trial. They're going to recount for you their memories, their observations, their impressions of what people said, what they saw. Just as we talked about earlier, you can hear direct evidence of what people saw. But much of the evidence in this case is digital evidence, and it comes from these. These things we carry around in our pockets and in our purses, they're wonders of communication. They really are. I'm old enough to remember life without them. But it's hard to imagine life without them now. We live on them. Everywhere we go, we put on maps We're in contact, constant contact. Adults, teenagers, all of us. What you're going to learn is that everything that someone types into these phones, whether it's a text messages or through a social media app, is recorded somewhere. And unlike scraps of paper or letters that people would send years ago, the messages sent through this, they don't go away. They're not just thrown away. They can't be burned. They can't be deleted. I tell my kids they're tattooed on the ether. They're there forever. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but they're there they're certainly recorded on some server somewhere at some headquarters of a technology company. And most of us don't think about it. Most of us go through our lives not thinking about that every text message, that every Instagram message that we send is recorded by a company. But that's the truth. Until some detective comes along with the tools and the knowledge to gather those bits of information and that recorded. And that's much of the evidence that you're going to hear. That evidence gathered from those companies is going to tell you in his own words what Owen Shover was doing in the months and the days leading up to January 13th, why he was doing it, and what he had on his mind. So let's start. Let me tell you about what that evidence is going to show. Between November 27th, we're going to go back about 6 weeks before January 13th. So between November 27th, 2018 and January 4th, 2019, January 4th is 9 days before Rhonda's disappearance. The defendant used Snapchat Messenger to reach out to 7 different individuals trying to buy a gun. He often used a slang term called a strap, but he reached out wanting to purchase a gun. And much of the conversation, text message conversation through Snapchat Messenger, was about if there was a gun available, if so, how much, that kind of thing. But there are 2 conversations that stand out that I'm going to read to you, at least partially. The first one occurred on January 1st, 2019, so 13 days prior to Rhonda's disappearance. The defendant reached out with his screen name to someone with a screen name of DTOYOUNG. The defendant made it clear he was looking for a handgun. Here's what he said. Handgun, don't care about how many bodies are on it, just need some cheap, not planning on keeping it. 9 days later, on January 9th, 2019, 4 days before Rhonda's disappearance, he again used his Snapchat Messenger to reach out to someone else looking for a gun. This time it was an individual named Hayden Torres. You're going to hear from Hayden. Hayden's going to tell you she was friend, ex-boyfriend of Owen Shover, ex-girlfriend of Owen Shover. This message was part of a longer conversation, and Owen said to Hayden, in addition to looking for a gun, he also commented, and excuse my language, but I'm going to read to you what was said. I can kill a motherfucker and not fucking care, but it's random shit that's getting to me. That was January 9th, 4 days before Rhonda's disappearance. Let's move now to January 12th, 2019, the day before Rhonda's disappearance. The defendant, Mr. Owen Shover, again with that trail, that digital trail of evidence that he left. And that's what he did. He didn't mean to. In fact, he meant to cover it, and you'll see evidence of that as well. But he either was reckless or didn't realize that everything he was posting and saying was recorded and would be later collected up by detectives. So on January 12th, Owen Shover does 3 things that are significant, the evidence is going to show. First thing he did, January 12th at 12:45 a.m., so just after midnight on the day before, or January 12th is the day before Rhonda's disappearance, he contacted Rhonda Bionas, again using a social media messaging feature on one of the apps. I want to read you what he said. I'll read you the conversation between Owen Shover and Rhonda. The defendant, "Hey, you got plans tomorrow?" Rhonda responds at 9:01 a.m. on January 12th. She responds, "Sunday, question mark." Defendant then responds at 10:56 a.m. on January 12th. "Today." "When?" Rhonda says, "What are we doing and how illegal is it?" The defendant says, "I was thinking just hand out smoke and probably rob some people." Rhonda says, "When?" Defendant says, "When it starts getting dark, and if you really down, we can rob some dealers." Defendant says, "Just hit up the ones who ain't got straps." Rhonda responds, "I'm MF down." Defendant says, "Probably around 4 or 5. Rhonda, Fosho, F-O-S-H-O, all H-Y-U. I'll hit you up. Defendant, F-S, for sure. Evidence is going to show that that was the first thing Owen Shover did on the 12th. What he did later that day was he created a fake Instagram account. He had his own Instagram account, Owen Shover did, and you're going to hear that in his mom's home, using a computer in a spare bedroom, he created a new Instagram account. And this one had the name of Rodrigo attached to it. And with this Instagram account, there's only one message. I'm sorry, there's only one conversation. The Rodrigo account and Owen's Instagram account. And that Owen created a fake conversation for himself, between himself. What did that conversation say? The conversation was about setting up a drug deal. And it went into some detail about a pound of marijuana and where this drug deal would take place. And specifically, that the drug deal was to take place in the Box Springs mountain area above Moreno Valley. Now again, there is no Rodrigo. There is no drug deal. There's no pound of marijuana. This is Owen Shover sitting in his house, his mom's house, creating a fake dialogue back and forth and putting those details in there. At 5:05 p.m. on the 12th, Owen Shover performed a web search on his phone, pulling up maps of the Box Springs area of Moreno Valley. And those maps correspond to what Rodrigo, the fake drug dealer, where he told him to go. Let's move to January 13th. Owen Shover has already contacted Rhonda Bionas, told her they're going to go hand out smoke and probably rob some people. By the way, you're going to hear Rhonda, misguided though it is, she's telling her friends, I'm going to go rob some people. January 13th at 11:14 a.m., the defendant reached out to his brother Gary on Facebook Messenger, and he said the following: "Be ready for tonight. Get shovels and lighter fluid ready. I won't be home till later." Gary responded at 11:49. "For show, I'm gonna head to Jacob's right now, but I'm gonna put them on the side of the house." January 13th at 2:38 p.m., Owen Shover takes screenshots of maps of the Box Springs area of Moreno Valley. Again, those maps correspond to what the fake drug dealer Rodrigo said he wanted him to go to do this purported drug deal. The next thing that Owen Shover did was that he contacted Rhonda to arrange their meeting at Bayside Park in Moreno Valley. And he left his mother's home, and Rhonda left her home, and they met there at that park. Now, at this point, there's something else, another kind of evidence. I told you that everything that we say, we type, gets recorded on these things and is recorded on a server somewhere. But what you may not know or may not be as familiar with is that these devices that we carry with us are also geolocation devices. They're constantly reaching out for connection. They have to. That's the way we can drive around and maintain a phone call. They automatically reach out to the closest tower, cell phone tower. And it's recorded when that happens. Each time it happens, it's recorded. And so if you carry one of these around, that information can be collected. And your exact position can be determined from the information that is recorded by the cell phone company. And again, we don't think about that. Most of us don't think about that. Until the detective comes along again with the know-how to pull that information. And so the exact location of Rhonda Bionas and Owen Schober is known to us. Where they went, exactly where they went, and what time they went there. Detectives took that path of travel that they determined by using the cell phone data and that geolocation evidence, and they plotted the path of their movements out on a map. And then they went through, and the route that they took, they went and looked for security cameras from businesses, from homes, anywhere they could, to corroborate if they saw the white Nissan Versa taking that path, so that they could plot out exactly where they went and the timing of where they went there. This becomes important. But at this time, I'm going to show you a video of exactly where they traveled that day, along with the cell phone data. Now, I got to mention one other thing. A few minutes after Rhonda Bionas got in the car with Owen Schober and was driving, she also posted 2 videos of herself and Owen Schober in the car. So that's also included in this video that you're about to watch. So as the video plays, I will stop it from time to time to tell you what the evidence is going to show with that. But at this point, Jim, would you play the video?
Mr. Ashton, is there any audio on this video?
There's a brief moment of audio, but I would be fine if the court reporter did not record it.
Mr. Ashton?
That's fine.
All right. We'll agree to the stipulation.
That one shit.
want to point out a couple of things before the video continues. One is that Rhonda's last message was to her friend Amanda Johnson, one of her close friends. You're going to hear from Amanda Johnson. That message, there was a mention of it, of the timing of it, at 5:10 p.m. Cell phone location data shows both defendant and Rhonda stopped traveling and came to rest at a remote area of Box Springs. At 5:15 p.m., Rhonda receives an incoming message indicating her phone is still on at that time. Still in the Box Springs mountain area. At 5:19, Rhonda is active on Snapchat for the last time. She sent a Snapchat message to her friend Amanda Johnson with the username of Elaine19, stating, "I'm big whipping RN right now. The homie is letting me use his cars for deliveries, LOL." Johnson immediately replies saying, "Be safe, ho," with a smiling emoji. Rhonda then responds, "I will." Her phone goes off dead shortly after that. The defendant stays, his car and his cell phone stay stationary in Box Springs from 5:10 p.m. to 5:43 p.m., 33 minutes. At 5:43 p.m., the defendant is on the move again. You can see here leaving the Box Springs area and getting on the 215 freeway. We're about to get on the 215 freeway. At that moment, defendant used another fake social media account, this time under the name of Andrew Lopez, and he used this fake social media account to contact a friend of his brother Gary up in Hesperia. And he says, "Tell Gary to be ready, I'm on my way home." A few minutes later, this friend Jacob, who you'll hear from, responds saying, "Pick him up at my house." 5:46 p.m. cell phone location data shows the defendant begins to travel out of Moreno Valley, heading north on the 215 freeway. And at this point, at exactly this point that the map is stopped at, I need to point out what the evidence doesn't show. At no time does the evidence show that Owen Shover's cell phone went back to Moreno Valley. And this moment in the map and in the cell phone location data is the critical moment. Because to go back to Moreno Valley, it would have turned left on that road. There's only one road. But he turned right, and he headed towards the mountains. Owen Shover had told police that after their short time up in Box Springs, that he returned to Moreno Valley and dropped off Rhonda Bionas at Community Park, where she got into a gray, small sedan. This evidence shows he didn't do that. He went straight to Hesperia. You could go ahead. I want to mention here, and I should have mentioned a minute ago, investigators also, when they determined the direction of travel of Owen Shover's phone, they also went back and looked at camera views from around Community Park. And you'll hear from the investigators that did that. They did not see this car at Community Park, dropping off anyone. At this point, investigators are able to zoom in on the passenger seat. You previously saw video that Rhonda Bionas posted of herself and Owen Shover in the car. This appears that Owen Shover is the sole occupant of the car, at least in the front part of the car. In other words, you can see it doesn't look like anyone sitting in the passenger seat. A few final comments we'd like to finish up. You saw from the geolocation data and from the video evidence that after 8:33, or you didn't see this, but after 8:33, when the defendant and his brother Gary are in the San Bernardino Mountains, the defendant's cell phone is abruptly powered off. At that point, it stopped reaching out to the wall. Talk to you about one more part of the investigation, the last part. That's the forensic evidence collection part. And that's a little different. The sheriff's team has, sheriff's department, sheriff's office has teams of forensic technicians and investigators as well. So there's several crime scenes that had to be processed in this case. One of them was, there's a glare because it's in plastic. It's the white Nissan Versa. As I mentioned earlier, the Nissan Versa belonged to Stephen Shover, registered to Stephen Shover, the defendant's father, and it was the car that Mr. Shover drove to work on most days. You're going to hear from Mr. Stephen Shover, the defendant's father in this case. He's going to tell you a couple of things. One, he's going to tell you that the next day when he went to go to work, it would be on the 14th, he drove the car to work and then realized that his tools that he kept in the back of the car, in the trunk portion or the hatch portion of the Nissan Versa, had been moved. And that the back area, the hatch area, the seats were down. And the tools that were normally kept there in the very back had been moved behind the front of the driver's seat. He's going to tell you that there are some things missing out of the car. He's going to tell you, Mr. Shover is going to tell you that he also found shovels and lighter fluid by the side of the garage, by the side of the house actually. And that he has no explanation for how they got there. Didn't use them, wasn't digging, there was no construction going on at their property. Mr. Shover is also going to tell you that on January 14th, he found his sons, both sons, washing their clothes. And that was unusual. They didn't normally wash their clothes. And they were washing their jacket and some other things. And when he asked them, they said, they're dirty. He had to wash them. And so there was a search done of the home in Hesperia. There's a lot of items of evidence, a lot of items that were looked at, but probably the most important were two pairs of shoes, two pairs of men's shoes. One was a Converse, and in that video you saw Gary Shover wearing Converse. If you look closely when he's in the gas station convenience store, he's wearing Converse type shoes, the black and white ones. And there's another pair of shoes, the Nikes, high top Nikes. Now, investigators have a substance called luminol, Blue Star. Now, what this substance does when it's applied to an area, it lights up when there's been the presence of blood. And you can wash it, and it's still going to light up. So the way it works is that these investigative technicians apply Blue Star and then use a black light and see if there's been blood on that surface. And what they found is that the two pairs of shoes, the Converse and the Nike, found at the Hesperia home of Owen Shover and Gary Shover, on the soles of the shoes had blood, well, at least potential blood, luminol, was indicated on the entire sole of both shoes. There's another crime scene, and that's the white Nissan Versa. So the white Nissan Versa was examined a couple of times in this case. You're going to hear that it was first looked at all the way back during the missing persons investigation. When it was first looked at, they looked at the back area, and an evidence technician noted a couple of things. Noted that it looked like it had been recently cleaned. She based that on the idea that there were lines, like when you vacuum your home, there's lines, you could see some kind of line in the back of the truck, or the back of the Nissan Versa. You're also going to hear that that first examination of the Nissan Versa, which occurred on January 22nd, 2019, that the technician applied luminol, Blue Star luminol, to the back of that Nissan Versa, and that it indicated positive on the carpet area for blood. Also indicated on the latch area for blood. Now, the technician reported this to the detective, and the detective did not follow up. The detective released the car back to the Shovers. In the meantime, a few days later, one day later, homicide detectives took over the case, and they went back and got the car and examined it a second time, this time on February 1st, 2019. Investigators noted reddish-brown marks on the interior paneling of the back of the Nissan Versa, and this time they seized the car and took it apart. They took the back latch mechanism apart, and they applied the Blue Star luminol to the back latch mechanism and to the part of the trunk that's underneath the carpet. And what they found was a significant amount of blood indicated by the luminol. What they found is that blood had run, and you could see the dripping of the blood on the interior latch when you took it apart. So that blood had gotten inside the latching mechanism of the Nissan Versa. Detectives took swabs of that blood, or potential blood, the substance that the luminol showed as potential blood, and they sent it to a forensic lab, Sorensen, to do DNA testing. Now, obviously, they never found Rhonda's body. And so they first wanted to make sure that this was human blood, and it was. And then they wanted to compare it and see if it was Rhonda Bionas' blood that had pooled in the back of that Nissan Versa. And what they did first is they pulled blood evidence, DNA evidence from Rhonda's biological parents. And they compared it to the swab taken from the back of the Nissan Versa. And it came back positive. Then they went one step further. And they determined that the state of California actually collected blood samples from newborn babies in the early 2000s. And Rhonda was one of those babies that had her blood taken at birth. And they were able to pull that sample of Rhonda's blood and ask DNA scientists to examine and compare the blood that pooled in the back of that truck, of that Nissan Versa, and specifically in the back latching mechanism of the hatchback type car, to Rhonda Briones' actual blood that was taken at her birth. And then again, it was a match, meaning that a significant amount of Rhonda Briones' blood spilled in the back of that Nissan Versa. You're going to hear from Mark Fajardo. He's a pathologist, and he's going to tell you that in his opinion, the amount of blood indicated by the luminol, and we know it's blood because scientifically shown that it was blood, and not only blood, but it was Rhonda Briones' blood, that amount of blood was enough that she would have died, that was a significant wound. The last thing, at the search of the residence in Hesperia, found a little note. Can't be sure who wrote it, but here's what it says. Bailout meet, train tunnel, Pacific Coast Trail to Canada. Well, it turns out the train tunnel up in the high desert is a tunnel that connects to the Pacific Coast Trail. The Pacific Coast Trail is a hiking trail that runs from Mexico to Canada. And it turns out also that on Owen Shover's phone, when it was collected, was a search for directions to the Pacific Coast Trail. At the end of this case, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stand back up and talk to you about the evidence as it came out and give my suggestion of how you should look at it and analyze it. And at the end of it all, I'm going to ask you to do the job that you swore to do and hold Owen Shover accountable and find him guilty for the murder of Rhonda Breen.
Super sharp PowerPoints at the beginning of the trial and an opening statement. And number one is, mainly it's not my burden, right? And we talked about that. Number two, I don't want to give you something that can't be proved. Okay? What we saw in the PowerPoint, obviously, was a lot of speculation. So I want to talk about what can and can't be proved throughout this trial. Okay? And we can start by talking a little bit about Rhonda Bionas. As mentioned, she was a 15, going on 16-year-old young lady, okay, a teenager. She was into drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, using cocaine, doing drugs, and hanging with people without any restrictions. Right? She was running around late at night, doing things that maybe she shouldn't have been doing. And some of those things might have included robbing drug dealers. Right? I think that was mentioned that throughout Snapchat and messages you're going to hear, she's talking about big whipping, riding with the G, robbing drug dealers, and making deliveries, I think we can presume that those deliveries were marijuana and whatnot. And she, Rhonda, was friends with Owen Shover. They knew each other from Moreno Valley High, occasionally hung out, occasionally skipped school, and what they do, they got high and did what teenagers do, right? Maybe it wasn't the right path, but it was the path that Rhonda was on. Now, the people mentioned some kind of motive about an incident that occurred over a year prior involving a weapon, and that Rhonda confided in her brother that she was afraid of Owen. And this is important because when you watch the PowerPoint, when you watch the videos, and you watch the evidence that's presented, we look at those things, and when you look at it, you don't see any sense of fear in Rhonda being with Owen Shover, right? And in fact, she's Snapchatting the entire thing, right? And the people want you to believe that this incident from over a year ago, where both Rhonda and Owen were expelled, led to somehow this murder that they believe occurred. But what you don't have is proof of that, right? There's no body, there's no weapon, there's no evidence that Rhonda Bionas is dead. And some of the things that we know and we're going to hear about throughout the trial and the witnesses that come forward, I want you to keep an open mind and think about what they say, and then look at what's reasonable, right? And so the day of the incident, January 2019, Mr. Shover texts Rhonda and asks to get together, right? And she does. She willingly gets together with Owen. We're not contesting the fact that they were in the car together. There's video of it, right? There's Snapchats that were played already showing that they were in the car together, okay? Now, the Box Springs Mountains, that was an area that Rhonda frequented. She liked to go up to that area. She liked to hang out. She liked to drink. She liked to do the things that she did up there. And so Owen drove her around. Okay? You saw the path of travel, the cameras. Let me tell you a little bit about the cameras, though, what you're going to hear. The district attorney thinks they have a perfect case in regards to those cameras, but what you're going to hear is that a lot of the cameras that are citywide in Moreno Valley were not functional or operational prior to January 15th, 2019. And the day that Rhonda disappeared was January 13th. That was the last day she was seen, right? And so what else do we know about that? If Owen were planning this murder that the people want you to believe, without a body, without a weapon, do you think he's going to let Rhonda Snapchat pictures in the car with her? Doesn't make sense. Okay? At the end of this trial, the evidence isn't going to add up, okay? And we're going to be left with a lot of questions, okay? A lot of questions that can't be answered by the district attorney or any of the witnesses here. Okay? Now, the people provided you with a map of travel, and I think the words were something to the effect of, we have the exact location of travel by Mr. Owen Shover on that day in January, right? We all heard that. Think about the resources that went in to following that path, right? If they had the exact path to travel, you've got investigators, you've got deputies, you've got the entire sheriff's department at your whim. And you go to every one of those locations, right? You search based on the geo cell phone data, right? You're going to search those areas, and they did, right? The police obviously did. This was initially taken as a missing persons case, right? I think family called it in and said, you know, Rhonda liked to run around at night, but she usually comes back. That's what you're going to hear, that she usually comes back. And so they call it in, they treat it as a missing persons case, and they search, and they're looking for clues, right? But you know what? Having all of those locations didn't yield anything. It certainly didn't yield a body, any evidence that Mr. Shover actually committed the crime that we're here for, right? And the burden rests solely on the people to prove a couple of things, right? First, they have to prove that Rhonda Bionas is dead and was murdered, okay? And that Mr. Shover did it. And I submit to you at the end of this trial, they're not going to be able to convince you of either of those things because there just isn't proof, okay? Now, the route of travel and where Mr. Shover actually dropped off Ms. Bionas, whether it was Bayside Park or down the street, we don't know. But she was dropped off. And Owen's statement was that she got out and she got into a silver car, like a four-door sedan. Okay? That is actually an important fact because we should hear that there was an incident prior involving Rhonda getting into a silver four-door vehicle that was involved in a collision. You determine how relevant that is, but Owen didn't know anything about it. Okay? Look at all the facts, look at the evidence, and keep an open mind. That's what we ask, right? And look at some of the other things. The video showing this little hatchback Nissan Versa, right? And where does it go? We have video of it at an Arco gas station, and I think the people put in there, it appears he's looking in the back, right? I hadn't seen one in the back. This is a small hatchback vehicle, and it's their position, and they're going to want you to believe that something happened in that 20 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes, up in the Fox Springs Mountains where Rhonda liked to hang out, right? That somehow, even though I think even the people admit they don't know how or what was done, but something was done, right? That's what they believe. Now, if Owen attempted to commit the perfect or near perfect murder, this presumed blood, that's what we're going to call it now, because that's what the district attorney used. It was presumed to be blood, right? We know her DNA is going to be in the car. I'm not denying that. There's video of them hanging out, doing whatever they're doing, driving around the city, okay? But there isn't a single person that's going to be able to come in and tell all of us that Rhonda is dead. And some of the things we talked about initially in jury selection is, not to speculate, right? Base your decisions on the facts and the evidence presented. And look at Owen. When you look at the video and you see it throughout the trial, you're going to see more video of the vehicle up at the gas station at the Arco, and he's not acting strange or nervous or anything. In fact, there's other cars coming right by the gas pumps. If there was a body in the back of that car, does that make sense? Is that going to be a reasonable interpretation that he's taken the body from Moreno Valley up to the high desert? I mean, this is all speculation, right? There isn't going to be proof that any of this happened, okay? And that's why the government's going to try to bring in prior incidents and say that she was afraid and say all these things to get you all to believe in their theory that this crime actually occurred without the proof, okay? And so look at his demeanor. Look at his demeanor in the interviews with the police. He was interviewed on the 14th and said he dropped Rhonda off at the park. Very basic. I don't know about you, but I don't like talking to the police even when I didn't do something wrong. Like if I get stopped, it's just a nervous feeling. It is what it is, He was very basic with his statement to the police, and then gives another one a couple days later. But you know what? We don't have proof. And you aren't going to be presented with that proof throughout the trial. Okay? We talked about the circumstantial evidence and things like that, and I don't think we're going to see a turtle with catbirds. But I just want you to think about everything and look at it independently. And everybody has their own thought process. Okay, look at the witnesses when they're on the stand. Listen to their demeanor. Listen to what they say. Listen to the time that's passed between when initial statements were made and statements were made recently. Okay? You have to consider all of that at the end of this trial. And I'm going to ask, and I believe that justice is going to require, that you find Owen Shover not guilty at the end of this trial. Okay? Because the people have the burden, and there is no way they're going to meet that burden. I want to talk a little bit about the car, the Nissan Versa. Now, not disputing that Owen had it on that day, January 13, 2019. Brought it back to Dad's house. He drove it because Mom lives down in Moreno Valley, so that's why he had the car. And he had plans of hanging out with Rhonda that day. When he brought the car back, the police took it, searched it, released it back to him, even after allegedly finding presumptive blood, right? and that car was in Dad's possession for over a week. If there is so much blood, the district attorney is saying that's pooling, you don't think it's going to have some kind of smell throughout that week? Blood, as it sits, has a very copper-like metallic smell. The fact that tools are allegedly moved from the back of the car, I think, is going to be a smoke and mirror kind of thing, right? I think there's a lot more to why a thing or a set of tools could have been moved from the back of a car, you know. Consider all that. But don't get caught up in little things that aren't reasonable, okay? And the people want you to think and see these text messages again. And I apologize for going back and forth, but Owen's looking for a strap, right? He's looking for a gun. There's going to be a few messages where he's looking for a gun, but guess what? He never got one. And they're not going to be able to prove to you that he ever found one. So what does that tell us? Why did he want a gun? Why did they want to rob drug dealers? This is where I'm saying at the end of the trial, we're going to have more questions than answers. Okay? And why we talk so strongly about that burden of proof, and that it's not my burden to prove, it's the people's. Okay? And so when we have those questions at the end of this trial, again, we're going to get up here and we're going to have a PowerPoint. And we'll talk about all the holes in the investigation, the searches that were done. I mean, they brought cadaver dogs out. Did they bring a cadaver dog to check the back of the Nissan Versa? Look for things like this. They brought cadaver dogs to the areas that they believe, not my words, the exact location of travel that Owen went, right? They searched. Not only did the sheriff's department search, they brought massive amounts of people to search. Massive amounts of, well, I don't want to say massive amounts of cadaver dogs. I don't know how many cadaver dogs, but drones, things like that. And you know what they found? Nothing. Now, there actually was evidence up towards Lake Arrowhead where Owen Shover's family had a cabin. That a big bag of marijuana was actually found up there with some E&J brandy. So there is potential evidence of drug dealing going on and things like that. But his family had a cabin up there. And the district attorney also mentioned that, you know, Stephen Shover's going to come in and say, you know, it's a little weird that there was shovels and a lighter fluid outside, but guess what? They searched that house too. Okay? And they located what they told you was a couple pairs of shoes that had presumptive blood on them. What does that prove, ladies and gentlemen? Does it prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder occurred? It's 100% speculation to assume that something happened in the Box Springs Mountains and that Owen must have driven Aranda's dead body up through the high desert and somehow took Gary Shover and buried the body up there. You know why I say that? Because it's the proof. It's the facts. It's the lack of evidence to support that conclusion. And so I simply ask, and I'm almost done, to just keep that open mind, listen to the witnesses, see the holes, and at the end of this trial, we're going to stand up here, Ms. Kistner and I, one of us, with a PowerPoint detailing all the holes, the lack of investigation, the failure to follow up on subsequent tips and leads. We're going to hear about that during this trial because law enforcement zoned in on one person, Mr. Shover. Now, once they had made up their mind that it was Owen Schober, that's it, right? They focused on him. They said, well, his statement was deceptive, right? We don't believe he dropped her off at this mountain. So therefore, he's a liar and he's guilty, right? I mean, that's really where this goes. And some of us who have been wrongly accused are going to be offended at the end of this trial, okay? And when you look at everything, the only verdict is going to be not guilty.